Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wednesday, March 8th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined here in the studio by two distinguished guests. We're very pleased to have with us today Secretary of Education, Daniel French, and a former BRSU school superintendent not so long ago. Dan, great to have you back in the neighborhood. Really appreciate your time. And also, really great to have with us today Jennifer Samuelson, who is the chairwoman of the Vermont State Board of Education. She wears several hats. She is also the school board chair up in the Windhall School District. And Jennifer, great to have you here as well. Thank you very much. I was thinking this is probably one of the first times in history when we have an education secretary and a board chair of the State Board of Education from Southern Vermont.
Oh, yeah, that could be true.
I think that's fairly close. Anyway, it's just great to have two influential people from our neck of the woods here, influencing things up in Montpelier. Really good. Anyway, but thanks again for your time. And well, we've gotten through town meeting and on into the next phase, I guess. But I thought as we're moving on, there are always lots of questions and issues going on in the world of education in Vermont, and obviously, one of the big ones right now, as I'm sure we all heard as we made the rounds of town meetings, is this whole question of financial support for independent schools. By way of background, of course, last year the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a decision, Carson versus Macon, which held that if a state was going to provide public tax dollars for one independent school, it had to make it available for all, including explicitly religious schools, and that seems to bump up against a clause in the state constitution that would seem to be, I guess, to the compelled support clause, and I'll let you explain that later because you know it better than I. But anyway, the question then becomes the traditional model of public support for independent schools in towns that don't have their own school is now been thrown into some kind of turmoil. Would that be the right word? So I guess I just wanted to see if you could both bring us up to speed on kind of where things are at up in Montpelier. I know the state legislature has been working on a couple of bills, including one that just emerged fairly recently, last week, I think. But Secretary French, what is your takeaway on this? Where are we going, and what's the pathway out of here?
Well, you asked some complex questions there. I will say, and I can comment to a certain extent about the General Assembly and the legislature, but we've certainly been working on the aftermath of the Macon decision. We were subject to several lawsuits predating the Macon decision in Maine. And once that decision came down, we had to reevaluate our situation relative to those cases, and basically have been seeking to settle those cases and have done so. But we, and the governor's been on record repeatedly, he's a strong supporter of independent schools. We don't support further regulation. We think as you mentioned, our historic approach to independent schools has served our state well over the years. And the state board, to its credit, has made a lot of progress in strengthening the regulation of independent schools. So we don't believe additional regulation of independent schools is necessary. However, we are interested in the anti-discrimination provisions, which I think by and far most independent schools also support. So we think if there is a common ground, if you will, of the legislature, it's on the issue of strengthening the anti-discrimination provisions of Vermont law.
And would it be possible to simply just leave it as it is? I mean, or does the Supreme Court decision force some kind of change, even if it may turn out to be relatively minor?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, but I think our system has served the state well. And fairly recently, the state board has increased its regulatory oversight of independent schools. So, my preference would be to let that work itself through. We haven't actually implemented those new rules. They go live on July 1, 2023. And the formulation of those rules predating this board was rather contentious. And this board board has done a tremendous job bringing those rules to fruition. So as secretary, my first approach would be to let's give that a chance. But I think we do have to be attentive to the anti-discrimination provisions, and as we're moving forward with a new regulatory framework for independent schools, I think that stands out as an issue where we could make some more progress, and just reaffirm the commitment that regardless of a school, if you choose to accept public tuition dollars, you need to be committed to the anti-discrimination provisions of Vermont law.
And Jennifer, do you see that as a problem? I mean, getting through to that point. I mean, putting on your other hat as the chair of the Winhall School District, you have a you're in a non-operating district, right? So everyone is tuitioned out. Is that correct?
That is correct. So our students within Winhall attend a variety of public and independent schools. I do know that for the schools that tuition or receive tuition dollars from our families, all of those schools have completed the attestation clause saying that they do not discriminate, and it is noted on their website. So I think as far as Winhall is concerned, I feel like that has been buttoned up. I also think, back to your point about Carson v. Macon, my understanding what the Supreme Court said was that if you were going to extend a benefit to one organization, you can't deny it to another organization solely on the grounds that that other organization is a religious entity. And what the state board has done, putting on the state board hat, we updated our rules that apply to independent schools. The first batch went into effect last May, and as Dan mentioned, the next wave is going to go into effect July 1st of this year. So these changes were enacted before Carson was handed down last summer, and the first wave requires any independent school, as a condition of its approval, to certify that it is non-discriminatory in its enrollment and employment practices. So for all new or any independent school that's coming before us for approval or renewal of its approval, we are requiring them to fill out an attestation clause that's been prepared for us by the agency. And then effective July, to receive public funds, an approved independent school must also agree to accept any student regardless of the special education needs of that student. So I think both of those two prongs are really satisfying really important social goals that we share. And I think a lot of that, I think what Dan was saying about letting those rules go into effect is wise, because those rules are on the book. I know that the draft bill that was handed out last Friday is looking to codify a lot of what we have in the rules with regard to requiring this compliance with public accommodations and special education laws. So I think we're pointed in the right direction.
All right. Well, certainly an issue we'll be following with great interest, I'm sure, going forward. Fascinating how some of this stuff comes up. I also wanted to ask you about what your sense is of some of these broader, for lack of a better term, cultural questions that seem to be bubbling up. I guess my feeling is not so much yet here in Vermont, but obviously we're not excluded. But other parts of the country, there seem to be a lot of school board meetings where parents have shown up and have been somewhat eager to be involved in the management of the schools and kind of what schools are teaching, certain hot button issues around critical race theory, gender identity, all kinds of stuff that we never really, I guess, thought so much about until fairly recently. But I guess I just wondered if you're seeing some of that interest beginning to manifest itself here in Vermont.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I've been around for a while as a principal, a teacher, and a superintendent, so I can say issues of curriculum have always provoked interest at the local level, and rightfully so. I think, particularly in Vermont, people believe strongly in education, and we have such a strong tradition of local control, and our school boards are at the nexus of a lot of these forces. I think what we're seeing now, though, is a little different, and it emerged right after the end, I'll say, of the pandemic, or the active management of the pandemic, where I've observed nationally, talking to my colleagues from around the country, there's basically an organized attempt to really disrupt the deliberations of local school boards. It's not so much people have an interest per se in the topics, but they're actively choosing to disrupt lay people, school boards in their work of local democracy, which is disturbing. Where I've become involved as secretary is really to point people to the structures that have served us well over time to manage those kinds of contentious deliberations. For example, our school boards, almost all school boards, have policies on the adoption of curriculum materials, how to deal with questions or concerns around curriculum materials. So there are processes that our local boards can use. Maybe they have to dust them off a little bit to remind themselves of that. But we have a construct in the state where the State Board of Education adopts curriculum standards, and then local school boards adopt curriculum. So the decisions in Vermont around curriculum have always been positioned at the local level to maximize parental involvement. And I think that's very wise and very intentional because, education is a partnership between parents, teachers, and the school. And the decisions of curriculum are always, I won't say controversial, but, contentious to a certain extent, because it's one thing to say what you want your kid to learn or what I want my kid to learn, but it's another thing for me to say what your kid should learn. So that when we start getting into that boundary of telling other people what their students should learn in school, that's where I think our school boards are totally in the right position to moderate and mediate those sort of conversations. And my point in my experience in Vermont is that they have the tools to do that. And they might have to dust them off, as I said, but we have the capacity and the systems to really engage with our communities and our parents around these types of issues in Vermont.
I guess I think thinking back to a much earlier era when I was in school, the thought of parents trying to tell teachers or principals or school superintendents, what should be involved in like a history curriculum would have been like unthinkable.
Yeah. Well, it goes both ways. I think, we have a tradition, I think in Vermont also, again, I use the phrase dusting off. There has been a tradition, I think, in the state where school boards defer, perhaps rightfully, to their teachers to design curriculum. But under Vermont law, it's always been a construct that school boards adopt the curriculum formally. And I think by design, that means an interaction with the community, because that's, if you could imagine, that adoption would take place in an open meeting with parent and public input into that. So it's not merely a fact of like sort of deferring to the professional expertise, if you will, because that's all good and said to a point, but they're not your kids, they're the parents' kids. So you need to bring the parents into that conversation.
Has this issue come up yet before the school board, state school board?
State Board of Ed?
State Board of Ed.
Well, yeah, because we are currently in the process of going through the education quality standards that pertain to public schools. And this is in response to Act 1 of 2019, where it's an act relating to ethnic and social studies, and really recognizing the contributions of historically marginalized groups and really trying to incorporate a broader perspective into the curriculum, as well as sort of facilitating greater understanding within school communities and the families that they serve. So there's a State Board of Education subcommittee right now that is in the final stages of implementing its recommended changes, and then we will begin the official rulemaking process later this spring with the idea that those rules will go into effect probably by the end of this year.
Well, another issue we'll be watching closely, it sounds like. So I wanted to go down the rabbit hole here a little bit. And Dan, I guess I'm going to turn to you on this one.
Okay.
If I may, I've been fascinated to follow the recent discussion around artificial intelligence and various bots that allow you, it sounds like, a student to generate a term paper rather quickly, or sooner than it would have been the case if you had to actually do some research and sit down and type something out. That ChatGPT bot, I hope I got that right, GPT, whatever. Apparently you just say to it, hey, I need to do a term paper on the causes of World War I. Has to be about 10,000 words long, and help me out here. And out comes this term paper that a teacher may or may not, when he or she is reading it, go, gee, I didn't realize that Johnny could, knew all those intricate details about Austria, Hungary, and Prussia, and France, and all the rest of the issues involved in that. I once was in the position of having to write a term paper about the causes of World War I rather suddenly, and that was a memory 50 years later, I still have front and center of my mind. So I was thinking, man, if only they had that stuff when I was in college. But is that not only the chat artificial intelligence, but the broader implications of chat artificial intelligence? Is that something you're beginning to wonder about? How do we factor this into the equation?
Yeah, I don't know. I was looking to Jennifer to see if the state board is interested in regulating it.
Well, I think the state board might have an interest in availing itself of it because we need a research assistant.
Yeah, if we need all the regulatory things we have, all the legislative reports I have to write every year. I'm just going to turn them over to Chat GPT.
Yeah.
Why not?
Why not?
And they'll probably use it to read the reports. Why not?
And would they know the difference or not, or whatever? But I don't know. Is that you think an issue that's poised to become a bigger question?
I don't know. As a student of history, I can't think of a tool that was ever invented that was never used. So sometimes I think the immediate reaction is to try to put it back in the box, so to speak. I don't think that's going to happen. As we've sort of just in our chat discussed, there are applications of this on both sides of the equation. It's not just about students of World War I turning in term papers. It's also about instructors using it to grade the term paper or regulatory bodies. So we'll have to see how it plays out. To what extent this improves our quality of living, remains to be seen. But I think it is fascinating, that technology has really fundamentally transformed so many aspects of our society, and in many cases, education has been slow to appreciate those dynamics. And it's certainly, I think, if we look at our experience in the pandemic, where everyone immediately acknowledged that, remote learning and school districts that were very slow to adopt technology suddenly had to do that overnight. We've heard of large school systems in our country who literally had no laptops and then were jumping into remote learning, or even in Vermont. So education needs to embrace technology. And it's not just in the organization of education, it's in the organization of academic content, because the technology has an impact. You think about on the organization of the Dewey Decimal System, right? Basically thinking that a white male in northern Massachusetts could describe knowledge in a linear alphabetical way, right? All human knowledge. And to think about where the web and the internet has taken us now and how the creation of knowledge is much more dynamic. These are wonderful challenges to have. And I think in particular, as someone who worked as a teacher and a principal in the Northeast Kingdom for 15 years, we've always embraced technology as a way to really offer our students a more robust curriculum, a more expansive curriculum. So I think there's tremendous promise here with technology in education, and I'm amused by this, certainly, and cautiously optimistic. But we'll have to embrace it and make it work for our purpose of educating students.
Yeah, I guess I just wondered, kind of where the ethical boundaries of some of this lie. Is it, is it okay? Is it a valid educational experience if somebody who, let's say, didn't pay as close attention in classes, they should have, all of a sudden has to jam out a paper suddenly, and
I think it would be helpful as an assistive device in the acquisition of knowledge. I don't think it would be appropriate to use it as a substitute for the acquisition of knowledge. Because at the end of the day, the students are there to learn. And so if they're using a computer to spit out a paper that they had no involvement with, I think that's really defeating the purpose of education. So, but I could see that there would be times that it would be helpful to have greater technological assistance.
And this is nothing new. We were talking about curriculum. If we were talking about the calculator 20 years ago, people would be making the same conversations, right? And so I think we just need to embrace it, understand it, and understand how to use it wisely. It's not going to go away.
Yeah. Well, it certainly raises a host of interesting questions. But let me move on here and pivot to another question that I know has been one folks in the education field have been probably struggling with a lot. Is hopefully we're coming out of the pandemic. I say that in quotation marks. I mean, because a year ago I would have said the same thing, and well, we're still not quite out of the woods yet, but schools are back in person again, just about across the board. A lot of the restrictions that were in place 2-3 years ago are now gone. But my understanding is that, you know, there's still some information seems to suggest that students are still took a hit and are behind grade level or behind where they should be educationally, and not just academically, but also emotionally and psychologically. And I guess I just wondered what both of you feel is the case with that. Is it in fact that, you know, a lot of students, again across Vermont now, will focus on, are kind of a year behind or whatever, and are also kind of struggling, you know, emotionally, or is it a case where, well, you know, they're not really that far behind, if they're behind at all, and, you know, they'll catch up, or everything will be fine now that we're back to normal?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a lot of work to do to address the impact of the pandemic. It's unprecedented, and there's so much uncharted territory in front of us. But I think when we were first contemplating what we call the recovery, you know, coming out of the emergency of the pandemic, the idea of being behind or what's been lost, you know, learning loss was a very prevalent paradigm that was being suggested. But, you know, behind who is the question, right? Because everyone was put behind.
Yeah,
so,
right.
but it is fair to say that there is a dynamic between the impact on academics and the impact on the social emotional growth and the healthy development of children. Both are intertwined, and we know schools and school faculty and staff are struggling as well. As you know, the pandemic's affected all aspects of society. So to a certain extent, we can say what schools are experiencing is not unique. And we see that across all sectors. But schools are often the intersection of a lot of these issues relative to human development, child development, and so forth. And there is a sense of loss and a sense of, you know, where my sophomore year was like that, or my senior year was like that, and I've lost some opportunity, that kind of thing. So I think, you know, we have our work cut out for us in terms of recovery in education. We have, on the other hand, unprecedented federal dollars now moving through the system. Those dollars expire in 2024, so we have to make best use of those while we can. We certainly have a multi-pronged focus, as districts do, on how to maximize the impact of those dollars. The focus of those dollars largely falls into the domains of academics and social emotional needs of kids, and we have to have discrete, and we do have discrete strategies for supporting the adults that work in our systems as well. Particularly when you think about the social emotional needs of kids, our primary strategy to address those needs are the adults that we employ, teachers and staff. If those employees themselves are not in a good place socially and emotionally, it's hard for them to make an impact on students. So it's a challenging dynamic, to say the least. And but you know, on the other hand, there's a lot of really great work going on. So one of the challenges for me as secretary is to raise a sense of optimism and to tell the stories of the good work that is going on, which is heroic in some cases. I hear that all the time. I was sharing with you, I'm on the committee for the selection of the National Teacher of the Year. And we just were down picking our National Teacher of the Year from among 5 finalists. And to a person, to hear each of those teachers, and they came from all over different parts of the country, to talk about their story and their sense of optimism of what they've been through the pandemic and what their commitment to the teaching profession is now. It was you came away from that conversation feeling very positive and optimistic. They didn't sugarcoat the challenges we're facing, but there's a good story to tell here as well. There's a lot of really good work going on in our schools.
Okay. Is that your sense of it too as well, Jennifer?
Yeah, now I'm really speaking more as a parent, where you know, my own children have suffered the loss during the COVID years, and to Dan's point, I mean, they're not alone. I mean, the entire generation went through this. You know, my daughter, who's a sophomore in college, her entire class was unable to go look at colleges before they had to pick something and decide where they were going to go to college. So I can sympathize, but I think it's helpful, you know, from a parent perspective, to sort of remind my children, like, they're not alone, and to acknowledge the fact that this has been really hard. There have been setbacks. There's been a real loss, and, you know, grieving that is entirely appropriate. And then at the same time, we try to focus on the good things that have come out of COVID. You know, as a family, we were able to spend more time together. I wouldn't trade that for anything. And I think, you know, educationally, I think good things have come out of it as well. You know, now we have more schools that have computers and Wi-Fi. There's a greater recognition in flexibility, in that some things can be done not in person, and that's okay. In State Board of Ed meetings, we have taken to meeting mostly virtually because we found that it actually works. It's more convenient, obviously, for board members, but it's really more convenient for members of the public, because they can just, you know, dial in instead of having to drive 2 hours to have 15 minutes of public comment and then go back home. So I think it's important to recognize that there have been a lot of bad things that have come out of the pandemic, but there also have been some good things too.
What about the teacher burnout factor? One keeps hearing a lot about that, and folks retiring early, or just, you know, we're so worn out from, you know, the last couple of years that they're just saying, I can't do this anymore.
No, it's very real. Very real. And
are we going to be able to replace those folks? Or
no, I think and I say that fairly confidently, you know, because undergirding that is the broader demographic trends, you know, and the idea also that pre-pandemic we had fewer people entering into the teaching profession, but it also manifests itself in turnover of principals and superintendents as well. So it's not just teachers; it's everyone in education. So I think we've focused on a couple strategies using our one-time funds. One is we have to make the work of education more doable. And what I mean by that, the working conditions, you know, if you're an elementary school teacher not having enough time to use a bathroom or to only have 20 minutes for lunch and to have that with kids, you know, time needs to be looked at in terms of the school day and how to make the work more attractive to people. I think the second thing we're doing, and part of that strategy of making the work more doable, we have a significant investment in expanding wellness programs inside of education, because it can be a very stressful profession, and we need to ensure that all districts are committed to a broader employee wellness program. But the other thing we're doing, this is sort of in the theme of contributory negligence, I guess, is we want to make sure our regulations aren't causing the shortages. So we have a review that's been commissioned to firstly quantify what is the nature of the teacher profession in Vermont. Do we have a lot of stories about, you know, people leaving the profession? We found actually that we haven't had huge turnover or exodus from the profession nationally or in Vermont. Certainly, we could look at it demographically. There is a bubble of the population getting older, and those people are naturally retiring and what have you. But we also want to look specifically at our regulations and licensing and to what extent do they cause shortages. So you'll hear a lot, and it's been my experience both when I worked in higher education and as a superintendent, that Vermont has very restrictive regulations relative to reciprocity. So if you were a teacher from New York State, you want to teach in Vermont, from my perspective, that should be fairly seamless. So we should at least be able to get you in the door and heading towards getting a Vermont license. But in Vermont, we erect some barriers to that. And so I think we need to be a little more thoughtful about acknowledging that our regulations might be the cause of some of the situation we're in. And then to be more proactive, we need to acknowledge that we're now operating schools in an environment of constrained labor availability. That's a given. It's not about, how can we get more people? There are no more people, so we need to adopt that and then really devise our regulations to enable different people to come into the profession, or you'll hear a lot about grow your own. You know, how do we start earlier with kids to convince them to go into human services professions, and how do we perhaps pay for some of their college to do that? Those kinds of programs, I think, will be a lot more common. So we have some work to do in the state to look, again, on our side on the regulation side to make the profession more accessible to people.
Well, okay. I think I'm going to have to leave it there for today, unfortunately. I'm thinking, in addition to the teachers, we need to find more school bus drivers, apparently.
Well, that's honestly huge. I mean, the logistics will have a bigger impact than some of the others.
A lot of demand out there for those folks, Bill. Well, okay. Well, thank you both again. Jennifer Samuelson, the chair of the State Board of Education, and Daniel French, Secretary of the Agency of Education. Thank you both for being with us, making the time for this conversation. Really appreciate that. And again, great to have a couple of the locals up in charge of things up north. And thanks to all of you as well for sharing part of your day with us. Appreciate your time and hope you found our program interesting. We'll see you again the next time. Have a great day.